All right. Good evening. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. It's great to see everyone. What a lively group. We got 30 plus people, 35 people in the chat. Love to see it. Welcome, welcome, welcome to this talk by Dr. Florencia Henshaw, who is a distinguished and an award-winning author and teacher and educator internationally and domestically as well. Author of Common Ground, SLA Theory Goes to the Classroom, as well as the co-edited volume, Honing Our Craft. Florencia will be presenting today on input and output from theory to practice. And she is also the director of advanced Spanish at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, as well as president of the Downstate Illinois chapter of AATSP. So without further ado, take it away, Dr. Henshaw.
Thank you. Thank you, Jude. So Jude is the director of Region 4 of ICFL. And yes, small and mighty, downstate Illinois, here we are. Okay, so the topic for today may seem perhaps a little basic, right? You're like, well, input and output, yeah, I already know about that. I learned about that in school. You'd be surprised how much of what I see on social media, how much of what I see on textbooks, especially, the questions that I get sometimes all revolve around, are we on the same page about some of these basics, some of these fundamentals? So I do think that they are absolutely important to have a very, very firm grasp on, because otherwise a lot of things get lost, right? If we are not understanding the fundamentals of teaching, really for language teaching, input and output are absolute must know. And what I see a lot in professional development communities is a little bit of the this and that. They're having to pick teams, the who's right and who's wrong. And so it seems like you have to either pick Team Krashen or Team Swain. Krashen best known for comprehensible input hypothesis, Swain best known for the output hypothesis. And while even these linguists had their own rivalries, it was never meant to be a matter of you picking teams and then have to disagree with everything that the other team said. I think some of these polarizing discourses or following only one name or only one camp, if you will, sometimes doesn't give us the most complete or nuanced picture. And I think it's important to understand what these terms are about, and especially how can we aim for principled inclusion of both. I'm very much team common ground. So instead of getting lost in who's right and who's wrong, I'm much more interested in finding what they were both aiming for, what they were both actually saying, which they do have a lot of common ground. It just got lost in that obsession for finding differences. And what I mean by principled is really understanding the what, why, and how. So we need to make sure that we understand what we mean by input and output, what Swain and Krashen meant by input and output, why we would want to have a principled inclusion of both, and that has to do with a role in language development. Last but not least, how do we make that happen in the classroom, right? So that is, to me, sometimes the missing part out of a lot of the discourse, coming from articles and things like that. How do we translate that into the classroom? So hopefully these two webinars will help you have a good grasp on those three things when it comes to input and output. Bigger picture, why is it that we're talking about input and output in addition to being fundamentals? Is because when we're talking about proficiency-based instruction and proficiency-based planning, they're absolutely at the core of it. The very first thing that we need to do is, of course, start with a clear communicative goal and realistic expectations based on proficiency guidelines. That is the absolute first step in proficiency-based planning. If we're not starting with step one, the rest doesn't matter. The rest is not going to make sense. The rest is going to feel forced, or it's going to feel out of place. So if your goals are not based on proficiency guidelines, if your goals are not communicative goals, simply for any reason, no judgment here, your program simply wants you to, your students to take grammar tests and all of that, okay. Then what I'm going to say about input and output might not resonate a lot with you, because you're looking for the drills, you're looking for those tools that are going to help you accomplish very specific goals that are not proficiency based. So the big assumption for these 2 webinars is proficiency-based instruction. The fact that we have communicative goals that we're trying to achieve realistically. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean by communicative goals, because we need to clarify that as well before we proceed. And then, yes, of course, we want to provide input and then move to output. And by that, I mean the input part, are they able and compelled to understand? Output, are they able and compelled to convey meaning? Today, we're going to focus on the input part, and then the next session, we're going to focus on the output part. Before we get to that, again, I am very strict when it comes to making sure that we're all aiming for the same, because if we're picturing different kind of goals, then the rest is not going to make a lot of sense. So I'm talking about communicative goals with realistic expectations based on proficiency guidelines. And I absolutely love this quote by Sandra Savignon. Sandra Savignon, the mother of communicative language teaching, if you will. She said, if the purpose of language study is language use, and I love that she starts with if the purpose of language study is language use, then the development of language proficiency should be guided and evaluated by the learner's ability to communicate. And she was talking not just about the teaching, what guides our decisions every day, but also how we are evaluating that. And again, your purpose for your program of why they're learning Spanish, what kinds of goals you have for your courses may vary widely. That's why I love that she starts with if the purpose is language use. And language use doesn't mean only output, right? You're using language right now, you're using the English in your head to understand what I'm saying. So you're using language to understand. But essentially is communication our goal, our main purpose. And it doesn't mean just the linguistic side of it, although that's what I focus on. But of course, this is sociolinguistic and cultural side of communication as well. But the main thing is that the purpose of language study is not to master language. The purpose of language study is not to learn about language. Once again, if your program has that purpose, then the rest is not going to match, right? The development of language proficiency should be get evaluated. That's going to be different. But my goal is indeed language use, is communication. And so I need to keep reminding myself that my teaching has to be guided and evaluated by the learner's ability to communicate. And the proficiency guidelines are great at telling us what realistically we can expect when it comes to their ability to communicate. So when I'm talking about communicative goals, I'm not talking about the bottom 3, right? Let's contrast the top 3 and the bottom 3. What do you notice as a difference between the top 3, which are communicative goals, and the bottom 3, which are not communicative goals? And you can type in the chat. Functionality, says Christian. Oh, I like that word. Yes. Okay. Yes. What else do you notice? Topics, says Christian. Okay, so the topic is clearer, right? In the first, the top 3. Everyday tasks, Shannon, related to the top 3, I would assume. Teresa says there isn't a clear purpose for communication. Absolutely. And I think that has to do with the comment of functionality, right? What are they trying to achieve? Really good question. Stephanie says the first 3 are things we do in everyday life. Okay, similar to the comment of everyday tasks. Absolutely. Oh, Karen says discussing ideas versus memorizing. Oh, I love that. Karen, have you seen my slides already? I think you have. Okay. So that is exactly the main difference, right, between the 2. So in the top 3, what you see right there in front of you is the purpose, the function, right? The what are we doing it? You see it more contextualized. You see it more related to outside the classroom. Whereas the bottom 3, what is right? What is the primary thing? Language itself, form itself. It's not clear what the function is going to be. It's not clear for what or the purpose, right? Just question words, numbers, positions, right? We are almost looking at only the language itself, the form itself, for the sake of the language, for the sake of the form. And sometimes the purpose, if you will, seems very vague, seems very, I guess, to talk about the location of things, ask questions, but it seems very, very vague because it is an afterthought. The main thing, the main star in the bottom three goals is language itself. Why do I think that this is so important to talk about? Oh, we have another one. Sorry, the learner is lost in the second one. Yes, very good, right? Very good, Rachel. Absolutely, because that purpose, that function, puts the learner, right? As in, like, what are you going to do with language versus the bottom three is just language. I don't care about you. I don't care about your context. I don't care, right? I don't care about the purpose. It's just the language only. And so the reason why I think it's so important to insist on, are we really, really having communicative goals or not, is because there is a direct effect between assessment and instruction, right? So if you start with a goal, such as use numbers from 1 to 99, that's the classic goal you see in textbooks, right? Inevitably, I would do it. I would do it. If that's my goal, then I'm going to create a test where I'm going to try to see if they remember those numbers, right? What else are you going to do to test if you accomplish that particular goal? But if your goal is something more along the lines of write a review of a local restaurant, or really finish the sentence, test whether they remember, it's not the kind of test you would want to do, right? It's not right a local restaurant, right? And that tells you that direct effect between your goals and your assessment, and the assessment and then instruction. Everything is connected, one to the other. So that's why if we start with goals that may sound communicative, because like use numbers, oh yeah, you will use numbers a lot, right? Is not really communicative, because you're still putting form, you're still putting language as your main goal. And therefore, inevitably, it's not that you're doing anything wrong, but inevitably your test is going to be language focused. It's not going to be communication focused. So I love that comment that Karen made. Yes, we are indeed putting memorization over communication, where in proficiency-based instruction, we want to put communication over memorization, right? Now, this doesn't mean that I am anti-memorization. Of course, we need to memorize things. We need to remember things. Of course, memory plays a big role in language development and in our ability to communicate. Absolutely. But I'm not saying that we are anti-memorization. What I'm saying is that that's not what we're assessing. It's not what we're assessing. We're giving them the right tools that if they remember those words, if they remember those structures, they will be able to communicate effectively. But if they don't remember that particular word or that particular structure, and yet they are able to make themselves understood, or they are able to extract meaning correctly, then why penalize the student, right? So we're not going for, let's see if you remember the structures, let's see if you remember the words. What we're going for is, can you successfully communicate at your level, right? So it goes back to the quote by Savignon, and then what I said about proficiency guidelines giving us a realistic level of expectation. Yeah. So with our communicative goal in mind, then that's when we do a little bit of this backward planning, in the sense that now we think about what language is useful or needed. And here's where this may take a while. It took me a while this is where we need to resist that temptation of covering. I know we have been taught by many textbooks to just, well, I guess we cover the AR verse, now we need to cover the ER verse. So I guess we cover this 10, so we got to move on to something new, right? That we always need to be covering new structures little by little, as if all of a sudden we put all these puzzle pieces in our head together and voila, we have language. We know that's not how it works. And so instead of thinking of the language itself, because that's where our brain tends to go to, it's like, okay, but what language are we covering? We're going to get there. We need to start with what language is useful or needed. If you need new structures, then yes, you're going to have to include new structures. If you don't need new structures, that's fine. You're not doing anything wrong. There are plenty of structures in the language that are very, very useful. That are very versatile, that we use them in so many different contexts for so many different topics. And so just because you change the topics, it doesn't mean we need to have new grammar structures. It's all about what functions, what purpose, what communicative goals you have, and then how you're going to get the students to get there. I have to say, I have to warn you, just be careful with thinking, okay, let me come up with a good communicative goal so that the students will need to know the subjunctive. No, we're falling back on putting language first. It's not about what communicative goal do I need to teach the subjunctive, because now the subjunctive is still leading the way. We still need to go back to what communicative functions and goals we want the students to be able to accomplish. And then we figure out if we even need structures. The analogy that I give is the keyboard analogy. So when you look at a keyboard, and you use a keyboard, what do you usually ask yourself? Do you ask yourself, what words can I write with these letters? Or what letters do I need to write these words? So if you get an email, you have to respond to an email. You look at your keyboard and go, I haven't used the letter J in a long time. What can I write to this email that contains the letter J? Probably not. Well, Jude probably uses the letter J a lot, but I don't. And so what do? You don't do that, right? Hopefully you don't, right? Instead, you're like, well, what do I want to convey back to this person to be able to respond to the email? And then you choose which letters to press. And yeah, I use the letter A a lot. I use the letter M a lot, N, S, right? That's fine. That's fine. I'm not going to say, well, you know what? I've been using the letter S a lot, so I'm not going to use it in this email because I need to practice new letters, right? You don't approach it that way. You just go by what you need. And so the same thing goes for words, for structures, right? So what structures, what language do you need to accomplish this communicative goal? Okay, let's talk about some of the principles or fundamentals. And if you know about SLA research, second language acquisition research, you know that there are a lot of debates, not a lot of agreement on a lot of things, but actually, here's the common ground. A lot of people do agree on some fundamentals. Those fundamentals are first and foremost, of course, no input, no output. If you're going to ACTFL, you can get a sticker that says this. You can get a button that says this. If you go to the Hackett booth, we have stickers and buttons. What does this mean? That means that input is absolutely necessary. That is the one thing we all absolutely agree on. You need to have input or there is no output. Now, the rest, I don't know that everybody as in like 100% agrees with it, but I think with enough nuance, I would probably say maybe 99%. So the next one is saying that input is necessary doesn't mean that output is unnecessary. So we all agree indeed that input is necessary and no one's trying to take that away from anybody. But at the same time, just because we want to highlight the need for input, the importance of input, that doesn't mean that we need to become anti-output. We're going to talk about more about this particular item more next week when we focus a little bit more on output. And then the last one, which is related to something I'll cover today, is this issue of shortcuts, this issue of teaching rules or explaining the language. If there's anything that probably I would say maybe everybody agrees with is that teaching rules is not a substitute for meaningful engagement with the language. Now, there's different camps that have different views on the role of explicit knowledge, and that would be part of this teaching of rules and teaching about the language. But at the very least, all the camps do agree that just because someone taught you a rule, that doesn't mean that now you don't need any input on it or that you're good to go, now you know it, right? Nobody would ever argue that. So teaching rules is definitely not a substitute for meaningful engagement with the language. So if our goal is communication, once again, then yes, we do need to provide lots of opportunities for meaningful engagement with the language. Okay, so as I said before, this session is going to focus on the input side of things, and then next week we'll talk about output. So let's talk about input, and I'll start, or I have organized the session mostly around 3 misconceptions related to input. The first one is that input is exposure to the language. And I think that this one is an important misconception to clarify, because this, if we're not on the same page about what input is, then we're going to be picturing different things about how to make it happen in the classroom. The second one is that learning about the language counts as input, and that is not what people meant or even mean still by input. And then the last one, maybe not as common, but sometimes I do see a little bit of a misunderstanding here, is that you have to just aim for comprehended. So if they understood, you're good, it's input, it's acquired. I wish it was that simple. Understood or comprehended doesn't mean it has been acquired or even close to being acquired. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and sort of what happens to input. Let's start with the first one, which I think is the most important one to dispel, and that is that input is not just exposure. So input is about understanding language, bottom line, right? So not just drawings, not just gestures, not just symbols. So if the student is extracting language thanks to a drawing that you provided and not necessarily paying attention to the language, then the language didn't count as much. If the student is relying entirely on the gesture to understand you, not the language, then of course not. Same with, if you just talk in the target language the whole time, but the student is not understanding, not input, right? So it is not just exposure to the language. What we need to ask ourselves every time is, could it be done without paying attention to meaning, to this meaning that the language carries? And that's a question that is going to come up again in output as well, of course. And why is that? Is because the driving force of acquisition, or acquisition in a nutshell, is about making these form-meaning connections. We build a linguistic system by making form-meaning connections, not just form connections, but form-meaning connections. So if meaning is not there, then of course the student is not making form-meaning connections. Okay. So what I see in textbooks a lot, and probably what you have seen in textbooks a lot, that sometimes gets presented or sold as input, is something like this, right? These dialogues that have been written to highlight, showcase, demonstrate the use of a particular structure in a relatively unnatural way, where every form of the verb to be in Spanish gets used in these, 6-line dialogue. And if you notice here, it may look like input in the sense like, wow, look how much they're using Spanish, and look how contextualized it is, or look how, it looks communicative because it's a dialogue. But really, when you're looking at what the student is supposed to do, I did not crop anything out. I promise, I did not crop anything out. When you look at the action part, you see action, you get excited. Okay, now the students are going to be doing something, and then all they have to do is complete a sentence with the correct form of the verb estar. And so could you do that? Could you complete the sentences even if you had no idea what Selena, Marta, and Estefania talked about in their dialogue? So could you do it without paying any attention to meaning to that dialogue that was there? Yes, right. So the dialogue is completely a matter of exposure. It's just a matter of showing the language. Someone one time, I think it was probably a textbook rep, said something like, well, but that's where the teacher comes in, and the teacher can do something with it. And I looked back at them and said, no, it's not up to it. Like, that's not fair, right? If we're paying a lot of money for these textbooks, then you shouldn't just make the teacher work for it, right? What are they going to do with this dialogue? In some cases, I've observed classes where all that gets done is read the dialogue out loud, right? One person's going to be Selena, one person's going to be Marta, one person's going to be Estefania, and we're going to read it out loud. you can read out loud without having any idea of what you're saying, right? And so still meaning is not there. Also, the fact that we're using every possible form of the verb estar in such a, relatively complicated dialogue, like there's a lot of things that probably are going to take away the student's attention. It's just simply not doing the best for the students, not trying to accomplish anything. Most likely what is going to happen is that the teacher then ends up highlighting and explaining these forms, estás, está, estamos, right? But really the content of what these three people were exchanging is completely lost, is completely an afterthought, and meaning gets lost, right? So this is what usually in textbooks gets passed as input, but it's not really input. So what are the qualities of input? It has to carry meaning, right? So it has to be meaningful. The second quality of input for me, crash into, but there's different definitions of this, if you will, and I'll tell you what I mean in a minute. It has to be compelling or purposeful. That means that we want or need to understand something. And then the last one is at the right level. Maybe you were surprised here and you thought I was going to be saying comprehensible, or I was going to be saying +1. Sometimes those terms, comprehensible is a little bit vague. +1 sometimes can have the implication that we always need to be pushing them to be exposed to new things or understanding new things. Not always. Sometimes there's great things if it's at 0. What I mean is at the right level. And I love it how Claudia Fernandez put it in her chapter in Honing Our Craft. And she said, it has to be enough or good enough for the task at hand and in the given context, right? So, and I would say at least, right? If you want to go +1, you go +1. But sometimes it's okay if the student is simply understanding everything and they're understanding all words that they know, all words that they already have in the system. That is okay too, right? We need that to keep those connections strong and fresh. But it has to be relative. It has to be relative to the proficiency level, has to be relative to the context, right? The students, has to be relative to the task. And if you think about it, different comprehension questions, even when you're doing readings, videos, etc., some comprehension questions are asking you to understand something very specific, right? So the task at hand is pushing you to understand a lot, where sometimes you can understand just the very vague gist, and that is good enough for that particular task at hand. So this idea of comprehensible, some people misunderstand it to me 100%. Some people understand just the gist, right? So it all depends. It depends on what the learners need to be doing with this language. And that is another reason why I think purposeful has to be an important quality, right? It is relevant or relative, it is relative to what they need to be doing with this input. Now, let's talk a little bit about compelling versus purposeful, if you will. Krashen talked a lot about compelling, right? That input needs to be comprehensible and compelling. I don't know if both start with O and he liked that. But a lot of what Krashen was talking about, which makes perfect sense in an ideal world, is abstract purposes, right? That we find it inherently interesting, that we are intrinsically motivated to want to understand or need to understand. So, for example, he talked a lot about reading for pleasure, right? So entertainment, if you like a TV show that you like a lot and you watch a lot, and you want to keep watching and seeing, hey, what's going to happen next week, right? And so all of those things are part of just you being inherently interested in understanding what is happening, what are the characters saying, right? When you watch a movie, right, same thing. The level of comprehensibility is going to vary, right? And again, it's relative to the task at hand. Maybe you just want to understand enough to follow the plot, and that's okay. Now, in the classroom, sometimes I see it reflected as community building, right? So if the teacher is interviewing one student, right, and so that student is providing language, which then is input for everyone else, sometimes it's just a matter of, oh, they want to learn about their classmate. So I think abstract purposes definitely have a place, and they're perfectly valid. And I think probably may or may not be more powerful. This is the part of what research has not proven one way or the other, might be more powerful than external compelling forces. But the problem that I have is that in my classroom of 20 students, I don't know that I can always rely on them finding one thing inherently interesting. I think that if the students are not externally motivated to pay attention to something, a big part of them will not. As much as they want to be respectful to their classmate, if they don't need to understand what their classmate is saying, then they're not going to be asking questions or try to understand very hard. Even if I think a short film is super interesting and funny, if the students just don't find it very interesting, they're going to tune out, right? So there's got to be a way for me to make sure that they are still paying attention to the language. This is where I see, and if you have read Common Ground, you'll see that almost every activity has this concrete purpose, this so what, where the students need to do something concrete with that information, with that input, with that language. So if you prefer to call it extrinsic motivation, I'm okay with that. What is more powerful? I don't know. It has not been proven. But at least for the practicality of the classroom, where they may or may not be intrinsically motivated, I have to find a way of motivating them to pay attention to the language, to the input. So in a way, this is the accountability piece, right? That I'm holding them accountable for paying attention, and therefore I know I can determine if they have understood or not the input. What are some of these purposes? What can they do? This is in chapter 3 of Common Ground. There's a list, and these are just a few examples, right? But a lot of things are things that teachers probably already do. Indicating agreement, disagreement, true, false, matching, spotting the differences. I'll show you a couple of examples of that in a minute. Ranking in terms of preferences, putting events in order, testing their memory, following directions, acting things out, drawing. Sometimes it can be one word answers, such as who am I describing, what am I describing, associations between different phrases, sentences, and perhaps a brand, a place, a celebrity, drawing conclusions or confirming predictions, right? So this is what I mean by giving them a concrete purpose for the input that they're receiving, for the language that they are understanding. How are they showing to you that they are understanding the language? And notice here that I did not include translating. I'm not a big fan of just asking the students, what did I just say? What did I just say? Translate what I just said. The reason why I'm not a big fan of that is because I prefer to keep it in the target language as much as I can, unless I need to clarify something quick and we keep going. But primarily is because when you are asking the students to be translating so often, or if they associate the translation of a phrase as a way of understanding, they might get into that habit of wanting to understand everything you're saying, or wanting a good translation for everything you're saying, like expecting the subtitles. And that can interrupt a lot, right? So if we want them to get used to this, good enough for the task at hand. So if the task at hand is just, did you understand what you need to do? Maybe you didn't understand every word, but you understand what you need to do. Or you understood enough to draw it, you understood enough to say if it's true, false, then that's good. It's good enough for the task at hand. That's what I'm aiming for, as opposed to being able to translate everything that the teacher is saying, which will inevitably be very draining. Okay, let's look at several examples of activities, and you tell me, is it input or is it not input? So in this particular case, they have these two texts. It says there are 14 differences between the text below. Can you spot them all? Highlight them. So based on what we have been talking about, is this input? Okay, I see 3 votes for no. 4 votes for no. Nobody saying yes? Why is it not input? Here we go. You do not need to understand the text in our completed activity. Absolutely. Very good, Stephanie. And this is why I don't even bother translating that long paragraph. Even if you don't speak Spanish, you can still complete it, right? You are doing what someone one time said, this is a glorified word search. Yes, you are essentially matching symbols, right? Matching words in this case. But even if you didn't know if there were words, like even if I put it in a completely different alphabet, you're probably all you're going to be doing is matching symbols. And so if you can do that and still get the activity done, that means that nope, they do not need to pay attention to meaning. Therefore, this is not what we mean by input. Now, it may look like input, or somebody might share it and say, hey, this is a good input activity. But this is why we need to be informed, right? And we need to understand, but this is not quite input because you can do it without paying attention to meaning. And now, just because it looks, again, contextualized in the sense that, well, it is somebody's routine and, you know, there's so much language there and all of that. Once again, the task at hand, what do they need to do? It ends up being just a symbol, matching symbol search. Can you change it? Of course, but then why don't we start there? Why don't we start with a task that is already asking the students to be able to understand the text in order to spot the differences? So what could be another alternative of spotting the differences could be something like this. So spot the differences between the description and the painting. So if you were to do this and you didn't know Spanish, would you now do the activity or not? Is it input or not? Put these together. Yeah, see, right. So now if you don't speak Spanish, and notice that I didn't translate for you, you couldn't do it, right? And that is because, yes, now you do need to understand the language for meaning. And it is purposeful in the sense that there's something concrete you have to do, which is going to let me, the teacher, know if you're understanding or not understanding. Do you need to understand every single word perfectly? No, sometimes it could be that it's good enough for the task at hand, that they can spot the differences without processing every single detail in this paragraph, and that is okay. We're not going for processing every single detail in the paragraph because that is overwhelming for the brain. So we need to keep including these things. Little by little, we get them to notice the frequency of some of these structures and to be asking what it is and all of that. But if it's good enough for the task at hand, it's good enough for the task at hand, and that still counts as input. Okay, what about this example? So we have some paragraphs, we have some phrases. Where do the phrases go? Match each number blank with the corresponding phrases. Is it input? Yes, once again, if you need to understand, right? If you don't understand what is happening, then you will not be able to tell which phrase goes where. This activity is what's called text reconstruction. Text reconstruction is a great way for students to be reading actively. It's a good way sometimes for when you have longer readings to be able to break it up and include some blanks, and they have to figure out which phrase goes where. You can also do text reconstruction and figure out where the phrases go, which is, by the way, very low prep because all you're doing is you're taking the text and just removing some phrases and you're done. What you can do is, if you want to get a little bit more sneaky or tricky or whatever, is yes, of course, you can have more phrases than blanks. You can also have phrases that are like almost there. There's a detail that doesn't make sense for the context. So to give you an example, let's say it's a paragraph describing a house. And so it's la casa, right? So feminine, singular, and then some of the blanks are, some of the blanks require, let's say, the verb that would be singular, but then some of the phrases, they do make sense content-wise, but they're with plural verbs. And so you're forcing the student to also be paying attention to those smaller details of the language. So now we're pushing them to process a little bit more for the task at hand, right? That they need to be paying more attention to the detail of the language to make sure that phrase really goes there or not. Just an example, I'm not saying you have to do that, but in terms of how much you can make text reconstruction either harder or easier on the students. Okay, what about this other example? So in step 1, it says mark all the activities you did yesterday. And let's just pretend, of course, that this is in the target language. And then step 2, ask a classmate if they did the activities from step 1 using the questions below. So let's pretend they have the whole list of questions there. Did you work out? Did you play games? Did you clean your room? Right? Okay. And so now that they have the information, it says, how active and sedentary are you and your classmate based on the information you obtain? Is it input? Yes, very good. So once again, yes, they have to do something with it. They have to understand. And notice that even if you have this, ask a classmate, even if you have write down the responses, right? Even if it looks like interaction, you are the one providing them with all of the language. So all the students are doing is combining things, is showing you that they understand the items, right? But there is no output happening here. And we're going to cover that next Monday. So sometimes some activities may look like interaction. The students are making sounds with their mouths, but it's still input. It's still an input activity. And this is a good example to think about how sometimes we tend to associate input with just reading, just individual, right? Something a little bit more passive, if you will, when in reality, there are many ways that the students can be doing something very active with input, and even something that may look like interaction to the outside world. So another example here, I think this one's going to be pretty easy. So if the students watched a short film and now they have to put these sticky notes in the right chronological order based on what happened, and once again, pretending this is in the target language, then yes, once again, this is definitely input, right? The students need to understand in order to put things in order. What about this one here? Listen and mark the verbal form that you hear in each case. So the student is going to hear something like, number 1, cantó. Number 2, trabajo. Number 3, viajo. Number 4, estudió. Number 5, habló. And so they have to check whether it's the one with the accent or without the accent. All right, very good. Yes. So this is not input. Very good. Excelente. Right. So even though you may think once again, oh, but it's listening, right? It's listening and they need to. No, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that it's listening. It's still pure exposure to form. They have no idea what the meaning of these words are, and you can still accomplish this particular task. And therefore, this is pure forms. This is no form meaning connection, right? So once again, we don't have input. We need to have meaning. Okay, so the point of that activity with the we have a question. Hang on. Would it be input if you ask them to check all the words that they hear? No, so once again, if it's just check the words that you that you heard, then that's purely based on forms, on sounds, but they have no idea what the words are. As long as they know how they're pronounced, then there's no form meaning connection happening, so it still would not be input. Okay, pictures instead of words, then yes, if you are saying words, just pictures. So yeah, they have to understand the words you're saying and then say whether that was something that was mentioned or not, then yes. Because now we are associating forms, what this sounds like, with what it means, right? The picture, then yes. Yeah, good question. So the example of that activity with either just what words did you hear or which one is it with the accent, without the accent, we're staying at entirely step one or puzzle piece one, which is a perceived input. A perceived input is just noticed. They notice there's a difference between the O with the accent and the O without the accent, but we're staying entirely at the form. We don't have a form meaning connection yet. It says only at exposure, only at noticing. Which is better than not noticing at all, I suppose. Sure, but we're still way too far away from acquisition. So the next very important puzzle piece in the acquisition process is comprehended input. And notice, you know, Susan Gass used the word comprehended, not comprehensible. And that was on purpose because, you know, Crash in early 80s proposed a comprehensible input hypothesis, then Swain in 85, the output hypothesis. And so what Susan Gass was trying to distinguish here is that comprehensible puts it on the teacher. What is the teacher doing? What is the teacher, how is the teacher changing the input so that the students can potentially understand it? I'm sorry, my dog is making noises. It's making me laugh. However, what Susan Gass was trying to distinguish is that the comprehension action needs to happen by the student. The student is the one in charge. Now, the comprehensible part, which is the quality of the input or maybe what the teacher is doing, but what is the learner doing with that input? And that is that the student needs to be the one doing the understanding. And so what gets understood by the student is comprehended input. Even then, we still have these two puzzle pieces, which are in relative mystery. Or the fuel of many research studies, which are intake and integration. That means that only a subset of that input that has been actually understood gets prepared for integration. That is the intake portion of it. And even then, part of it that is more likely to be integrated still doesn't make it, still doesn't get integrated into the system. And integration, I guess now here's where we can say has become part of the system, which is then available for use. And by use, then yes, we mean output. Now, the one thing that is important to notice here is even though we have numbers 1 through 5, Susan Gass was not saying that this happens in a very neat linear order. In fact, a lot of things that they were almost integrated, but they were not. They end up still being processed sometimes at just a noticing level, or they understood once again, but they're still not integrated, right? And then the main point here is that output is not the final stage. Output is not just the product. We're going to talk about that next week, though. But that is an important puzzle piece that Susan Gass agreed with Merrill Swain that output could be part of the process. But that we're going to get to next week. The main point that I was trying to make here is just the frustrating nature of language acquisition. So you have all this input outside of comprehensible input, when you have just noise, right? That just forms with no meaning. But when you have this form meaning available as comprehensible input, the brain is only processing a subset of that. So even though you said it a million times and they understood it, that doesn't mean they processed all of it. So only a subset is actually processed, which means that now we're making that right form meaning connection. And I mean by processing that specific form, which could be the S at the end of a noun in English. And then only a subset of that is actually acquired. So we're dealing with a subset of a subset. And this is what makes it so slow. This is what makes it so complex. Why is it that some forms are processed but not acquired? Why is it that many things are understood, but we're still not processing so much of them? Michael Long put it very beautifully here. He said, what learners can process determines what they can, but not necessarily will learn. And this is sometimes what drives us crazy as language teachers, right? Is that we feel like we created such good activities, we're pushing them to process, they process them, and it feels like it all went nowhere. It didn't get in. There's no intake, no integration, right? It just has not been acquired, and they may not necessarily learn it, right? So this is the part that we need to, at the very least, aim for processing. Not every single detail, but we're going to get there little by little. We need to be aiming for processing, to be making these form meaning connections. So when we're talking about processing input, it's a very complex process, and it's influenced by many different things, but I'm going to simplify a lot here. Essentially, the brain is processing, is trying to extract meaning out of the incoming information or the incoming language using whatever linguistic system we have in our head to make sense of it, plus outside cues, plus possibility, right? But as efficiently as possible, which means that if they were able to extract meaning from somewhere else, there's plenty in that sentence that sometimes they do not need to even notice at all. It is influenced by other languages, their native language for sure, but then other languages that they might know. It is influenced by saliency. Some forms are very small, as one letter, and so they don't get noticed as much. Some forms are much more salient, especially something like an adverb, prepositions sometimes. The location sometimes can also make a difference. We tend to process or pay more attention to things that appear first and last in an utterance, whereas everything in the middle sort of gets lost. And I do that with the students. If you tell them a story and you tell them a story several times, they remember the first part and the very last sentence almost perfectly, but the middle is a little bit of this jumble of, I think you said something like this, right? Here comes the gist, but the word for word where they remember the first one first. The main thing that we need to keep in mind, we don't need to understand everything of how they're processing the input, but the main point here for teachers is to keep in mind that the brain is processing the input as efficiently as possible. They're not going to be paying attention to everything in the input. It may be frustrating for you because you're like, but how could they not? It was right there. We saw it so many times. Doesn't matter. If the brain did not need it, the brain said, I can't deal with this right now. I have no bandwidth. I'm going to focus on extracting the meaning as best as I can right now. So questions that we need to ask ourselves is, first, where is their attention going? In the dialogue with the ducks and the ser and estar, or just estar, I guess, that we saw before, their attention is going in a million different directions. Even if estar is in turquoise, there's so much going on that if the student is trying to understand that dialogue, there's just too much competing for their attention, that probably estar is not going to be a priority. Could they get the meaning? Could they get the meaning elsewhere? Many forms in our languages are indeed redundant. We mark things more than once. And so if that meaning was already conveyed by something else, then the brain doesn't need to hold on to it. And then, are they getting the right message? That may be a simple question, but it's important because sometimes inadvertently we create an activity where they're not making the right form meaning connection. I'll show you a couple of examples. If we look at these examples, one from English, one from Spanish, not brave enough to do one in Italian or French or German. So if you look at the first one, there is a lot of redundancy, right? We are conveying things more than once. So you have that adverb yesterday, which is nice and big and appears first in the sentence, but then you have the past tense marker in the verb itself. Does the brain need to notice that the verb is in past tense? No, not with yesterday being right there, right? So that already is redundant, which means that they don't need to be paying that much attention or even processing that verb, except for just the meaning of take. It could have said take it, could have said anything, as long as they understand the meaning of the verb is good enough that it's past tense, because yesterday already told them so. And the same with the S at the end of dogs. How did you know I had more than one? Because there's a 4 right there, right? So even if the S wasn't there, even if you have 2 S's, even if you have like the form was anything, doesn't matter. I'm already picturing 4 canines, right? I'm already picturing more than one, but S is giving the meaning of more than one, which I don't really need because I already know she has 4. And then in the case of Spanish, when we have a sentence like "A Florencia le gustan los perros," if we have Spanish teachers in the house, tell me which of those little words is completely ignored, not processed, probably not even noticed. You can type. There we go. Or little a and le. A and le are like, they're not even there. They're not even there, right? Because they're not giving you a whole lot of meaning. You are extracting meaning as efficiently as possible. As Florencia, there's like and dogs, got it. You know, you get that message, you don't need it. Sometimes even los. Los doesn't even get processed either. So that's what I mean by as efficiently as possible, right? And the le is extremely redundant here because you already have the a Florencia. So to her, why do we have that le there? Because it's redundant. So the le probably is the one that gets ignored the most. Okay, so that's what I mean by where is their attention going as efficiently as possible, and then what are some things that they simply don't need to be getting that meaning. Now let's look at this example. So in this example, this is where I'm concerned about, are they making the right form meaning connection? So if you're a Spanish teacher, tell me what could be a potentially wrong form meaning connection that they could make out of an activity like this, which was created with very good intentions, right? Keep it meaningful, giving them input, got it? But they could potentially make the wrong form meaning connection. No, not necessarily the adverbs. Well, Jenna, that sometimes that is true for many things. We don't know if they are, we don't know if they're lying. Right. So they're very good, right? They interpret, they're going to interpret the yo and the me. Absolutely. Yes. So that could be potentially the wrong form meaning connection because in some cases, Laura, good question. No, they do not mean the same, but seeing it as is presented right here, you could potentially make that mistake, right? You could make the wrong form meaning connection to think that sometimes it's yo and sometimes it's me, and they're both the same, right? That they're both the subject pronoun. And that is a wrong form meaning connection. So in this particular case, if you're going to go with removing the subject pronoun, remove the subject pronoun all the way, right? Don't start doing a little bit of everything, because then we're not giving them a clear form meaning connection. Yeah. Another example here. So this one is with present perfect. It would work in many different languages, right? So I put them in English so it's easier to see. So what would happen, right, if we put the I have and then they have just the participle, traveled, been, visited, continue on and on and on. What could be a potential issue in terms of processing that we could be creating by presenting the input in this way? Yes, very good, right? So that they're going to be processing that participle as essentially the verb, the main verb. Exactly. They only use the participle. And that is because we're putting that have, which doesn't have a whole lot of communicative value. They're in the middle, even in the middle, right? It's like gets kind of lost where all our attention goes straight to travel, been, visited, right? So all the participle, right? So then we are potentially creating a case where, yes, the students are going to be just using the participle. Okay, the other misconception that I wanted to clarify, which is related to grammar, is this idea that if you're learning about a language, that counts as input, right? Because it builds the system. Well, that's not what scholars meant by input. As I said before, teaching rules is not a substitute for meaningful engagement with the language, and input is all about meaning, form, meaning, connections. So if our goal is communication, I'm going to start once again with that. If our goal is communication, then yes, our goal is implicit knowledge. That means the knowledge that we have of the language that we're building in this system that we may not be able to even verbalize. So it's not knowledge about the language that we verbalize, that is explicit knowledge. So when we're communicating, like right now we are communicating, you're using English in the chat, I'm using English right here. You're using your implicit system of English to process what I'm saying, and then you're using your implicit system to then convey meaning in the chat, but you're not explicitly aware of every single rule, if you will, that you are applying to be able to construct a sentence or to understand the sentences that I'm saying. So yes, our goal is implicit knowledge. Does that mean that explicit knowledge is completely useless? No, that's not what I mean by it. So we need to be careful with this lack of nuance, right? So the all or nothing, the pendulum swings. So either to think that, oh, explicit knowledge is the best thing ever, it's a shortcut, you go faster. That's not quite right, because teaching rules is not a substitute for meaningful engagement with the language. So you still need a lot of input. And then it's also not true that it's completely useless and unnecessary. So sometimes being aware of certain kinks in the language, if you will, or being aware of how the language works in an explicit way can help us sometimes to process the language better, can help us with self-editing, right? With monitoring, as Krashen put it. So it's not that it has to be all or nothing. But we need to be careful in that we are prioritizing properly. The problem with prioritizing this learning about the language or prioritizing explicit knowledge, thinking is going to be a shortcut for acquisition, is that most of the time what we end up doing is reducing fluency. The student becomes so concerned with form itself that they cannot really be using, they're no longer using their implicit system. They are entirely concerned with the correctness of this. Am I applying the rule right? Am I conjugating the verb right? Is this the right tense? Is this right? But then fluency goes down tremendously, right? And that's not what we want. We want them to build good fluency. We want them to build this implicit system. And then, yes, as we progress and we need to start tweaking some things about the language, then yes, of course, we want to be putting a little bit more emphasis on some of that explicit knowledge. So I'm not saying don't talk about grammar. Again, this is part of that pendulum swing, the all or nothing or picking teams. No one is saying you do not need to talk about grammar or that grammar is a bad word in language teaching. Fortunately, it has a bad rep, but that's not what anybody meant by it. What can we do really? So when we talk about this teaching grammar, if you will, or at least helping students acquire certain structures. So yes, we can indeed talk about grammar. The big difference is that we do not lead with grammar. If you start on your communicative goals, and as we covered before, and they were not about mastering present tense, then your communicative goals are simply supported by those forms, right? The letters on the keyboard. So you're not going to be all about, we need to use the T and the H and the N. That's not your goal. Your goal is you need to be responding to this email. You figure out what words you need to respond to this email, and therefore you're going to figure out what keys you need to respond to this email. Attention to form can indeed be good in certain cases, because again, it can help us with processing, it can help us with monitoring. Sometimes it's because we're making the wrong form meaning connection, and so then yeah, we need to be aware of that. But as realistically needed, not perfection, as realistically needed for their level and content. So in context. And I think once again, this is where the proficiency guidelines give us a realistic understanding of what we can expect of students. And so even though sometimes some of their output may make you think, oh, maybe they're making the wrong form meaning connections, you do not need to start panicking and correcting everybody. Sometimes it's simply the system has not made the right connection yet, still restructuring, and sometimes we need to give it time. But what we can definitely do is facilitate or increase the odds of noticing and processing. So in the examples that we saw before, we need to be aware of the fact that, yeah, some students are going to make the wrong connection between the yo and the me. We need to be aware of the fact that in a phrase like Florencia le gustan los perros, a lot of those things are not even going to be noticed. It doesn't matter how many times you say the phrase, it's not needed. They're probably not going to be processing it. So it's just to be aware of how processing works and how much we can expect the learners to be processing these forms. And then in some cases, depending on the structure, we can create activities in such a way that we are pushing the learners to process those pesky little grammar forms. So let's contrast these two versions. It's the exact same activity, but they are structured slightly differently. So we have version A and we have version B. In which of the two versions, A or B, do you have to pay attention to the ending of the verb? So in this case, in English would be whether there's that S or no S. Okay, let's see version A. Absolutely, yes. In version A, you need to pay attention to the verb. In version B, you don't. It's already done for you. So if you see in version A, everything has one blank. So you don't know if I'm expecting one name or more than one name unless you process that ending. In version B, I've done the work for you. So you already know if I'm expecting one name or more than one name. So you don't even need to notice that the verbs are different. So what I mean by we can help the students notice and process certain forms, I mean things like version A. One time someone asked me, would you start with version B and then move on to version A? No, because I don't want the students to get all confused. Like, why is it sometimes it's one? And no, what I would do is just do only things like version A. And before the students start writing anything, maybe you may want to ask them, hey, sometimes I expect one name and sometimes I expect more. How do you know? Right? And have the students pay attention to things and see if they can tell where that clue is in the input. That is perfectly okay. If you want them to become more aware of things before they do the activity, great. But I wouldn't do something like giving it away first that they don't even need to pay attention to the verb, and then all of a sudden they're expected to pay attention to the verb. I think that would be a little bit confusing. So just from the get-go, if you find a way of creating the activity in a way that they are paying attention to the verb, then yes, by all means do that. And then maybe do a little active, not giving it away for them, but asking them, how can you tell if I want one name or more than one name, right? So to make them pay attention to that. Another example, this has to do with gustar in Spanish. I know it doesn't work for all languages. So this one in particular, the teacher is going to be saying different things that the teacher likes or dislikes, and the students need to say whether it's something that she likes or doesn't like. But now in Spanish, you need to be paying attention to the verb, right? The verb sometimes is singular and sometimes is plural, depending on whether what you like is one or more than one. And so in this particular example, we're pushing the students to be processing both meaning and form, in the sense that they need to be paying attention to what is it I'm saying, spiders, chocolate, coffee, etc. But then they also need to be paying attention to that verb ending. Another example here, what are we pushing the students to process in this particular example? So if you're a Spanish teacher, what are we pushing the students to process? Muy bien, the agreement with the le and the les, right? Absolutely. So that le that usually gets ignored. So if we structure it this way, they have to be paying attention to that le or les, right? Yep, absolutely. Now, what about this version? This version, I wouldn't do it first, right? This version is pushing the students to process two things. And I think it's going to be too much unless the students are already so comfortable that some of this processing is done almost effortlessly, right? So in this particular case, now we're pushing them to process the le and the les, but then now we're also pushing them to process the verb ending with the singular and plural verb. I think this is going to be a little confusing to students at first. So unless they have it, you know, pretty, you got maybe the gusta and gustan part good, then I moved on to the next. But I think pushing the students to process too much too fast is going to end up in frustration and confusion. So make sure that you're targeting one contrast at a time, I would say. Something else that we can do that doesn't require being so sneaky, if you will, sometimes can be something as simple as making it easier to notice patterns, to notice these forms. So instead of the long dialogues with a restaurant and a fountain and ducks and this and that, there was just too much going on. Just simplify the sentences, right? So in this case, we're using a lot of cognates. We're only focusing on one form, the third person singular, he, she, slept, played, watched, etc. They're very short. They should not be competing for too much of their attention. We're making them say if they're understanding or not based on this particular comic strip. And then the other thing that I want you to notice is that it's okay to repeat verbs. I know in textbooks you see these activities where every single item is a different verb because they're supposed to be, you know, like, oh, but you already quizzed them on miró. Oh, it doesn't work that way, right? We need that frequency. We need to be seeing that more than once. That's actually beautiful for acquisition. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with using the same verb multiple times, right? The jugó appears more than once, leyó appears more than one, right? So, and it doesn't matter. Look, some of them are irregular. Oh my God, we're mixing it doesn't matter. Irregular is a concept in my textbooks. This is about the meaning, right? What did he do? What did he do? So then if what he did requires a verb that is a, you know, a stem changer or a boot verb or whatever they're called in textbooks, it doesn't matter. We're going for meaning, right? So what are the useful verbs that I want the students to be noticing, to be processing, to be learning, to be acquiring, right? So it move away from this idea that language needs to be so compartmentalized, right? And a lot of these same things go for vocabulary, and we do see it more in vocabulary than we see it in grammar, at least in textbooks, right? When you see words in vocab lists, for example, you don't see them being explained. Oh, this is this type of noun, and you don't see always the etymology, right? Nobody stops to explain vocabulary a lot, but for some reason, when it comes to grammar, we explain everything. So the same really goes for vocabulary, right? So we have to think about how can we prioritize and how can we simplify for the students so that they are engaging with that structure or that word multiple times. Are we making room for frequency? And then, of course, the same thing, what structures do they need the most and what vocab do they need the most? Same thing. The context, right? Being used in a meaningful context. When, where, how do we use them? Same goes for grammar, and it also goes for vocabulary. And I think for both grammar and vocab, frequency sometimes it gets pushed aside for the sake of covering, right? For the sake of new. But when you think about it, what's better, to see one word 10 times or 10 words one time? The brain is going to remember that one word 10 times, right? So then we need to think about how are we building enough frequency for the students to have a chance at remembering these words, at remembering the structures, at having them available for access. Now, when I say frequency, I don't mean repetition. And I've taken lots of language classes where I was told to, repeat after the teacher whenever we did vocabulary. Those kinds of things, we can talk a little bit more about it next week when we talk about output. But that's not what we mean by frequency. And for vocabulary learning, meaningless repetition doesn't do anything. So I'm not talking about just repetition of words, but actually this need to understand and produce the word, this receptive and productive knowledge. We produce the word eventually, right? But at the very least, we do need this frequent need to understand the word, not just one time and done, right? Just we understood here, we got it, let's move on to the next. Multiple encounters where we are understanding that word. So if you are doing something like picture matching, which is indeed input, the students need to understand in order to select the correct picture, don't just move on. Don't just do separate phrases, es moderna, es de 2 pisos, tiene una piscina, right? Everything isolated and only one time. Keep using the same phrase and add to it, the same phrase and add to it, the same phrase and add to it. So keep recycling these phrases, if you will. It is absolutely okay, not just okay, it is good, it's wonderful for language development and for acquisition. We need that frequency, right? The brain needs that frequency to be holding on to these words. So maybe at first they don't remember what ventanas is, but by the 4th, 5th, 6th time that they see it, they'll remember what ventanas means, right? So then we need to make sure that they have had enough of this frequency count of accessing that word and understanding what that word is, or that structure, right? For grammar goes the same. So I showed you that example. It's like jugó. It's there. It's fine. It's fine to repeat it. It doesn't mean that the activity is now wrong or is not varied enough. No, the brain likes that frequency to be able to hold on to things. And this idea of the need to know the word, the need to understand a word, is related to the involvement load theory, which is related to vocabulary acquisition. Now, this one was proposed more specifically in relation to reading, right? So when we're reading something, how can we increase the odds that the students will acquire vocabulary from reading? And the 3 components of the involvement load theory are need, search, and elaboration. And so this idea of giving the students only one time where they see a word and we're even given the translation, and then we sort of move on, then we're bypassing all of it, right? So they need this frequent need to be actively seeking the meaning of the word, to try to access the meaning of the word. And this idea of the involvement load theory, as I said, it is particularly related to reading. And when you think about it, sometimes what we do in reading is glossing. right? So we give it away for the students. We think, well, they're not going to know what this word is, so I'm going to go ahead and provide the translation in parentheses. And the question is why? Why do we do this? Why do we give it away? Now, I completely respect if it's a matter of it's just faster and more convenient in the sense that all you're hoping to do is just to support reading enough so they continue reading. So you're not particularly invested if they learn that word or not. It's just a matter of let's just, just so that they can keep reading. But if you are doing reading because you're hoping to learn some of these words, then glossing is just providing the translation is not going to be particularly helpful for it because once again, we are bypassing need, search, elaboration, right? There's no need. It's already provided in English right there. So sometimes they don't even notice what the Spanish is. And there's no search, right? They're not actively seeking the meaning of the word. So sometimes when we're thinking about vocabulary learning from input, then we need to think about to what extent is the student the one doing the work? Are we providing enough of this need for them to understand it? And then to what extent is the student seeking the meaning of the word? Okay, before we go, I do want to discuss briefly different sources of input, particularly in relation to resources and different types of resources. So essentially, sources of input in a classroom are typically the teacher, classmates, or resources. Teacher tends to be the main source of input. Classmates, let's put them aside for now because that has to do with output. And then resources are another very important source of input in classrooms, right? So these are things you find, things that the book comes with. So let's talk about different types of resources a little bit. There's a little bit of a continuum, if you will. We have simplified resources, which are like the dialogue in that textbook, right? Sometimes unnatural, manipulated. We see the use of one particular structure way too much. And sometimes it's pragmatically questionable, like everybody speaks in perfectly complete sentences. Well, that doesn't always happen. And then we have the other extreme of the continuum with authentic resources. And this is the classic pendulum swing, right? Everybody got tired of those forced and fake textbook dialogues. So pendulum swing, everything authentic, nothing modified, right? And the best definition that I could give you for authentic resources, there's many definitions out there, and some of them are problematic. But the best definition that I could give you would be something like not made for language learning. So it's a resource that you find side of the classroom and you use it in the classroom found unmodified. Now, there's a middle ground here that I think is very, very important, especially for novice level students, which is modified resources. So modified resources are those that could be potentially created for language learning, or at least adjusted for language learning. And the key here is that we are still respecting the language and the level of the audience. So we're not talking about those very unnatural dialogues or paragraphs we saw in textbooks. We're talking about something where the students are learning important content or interesting content, even stories, but they're done in a way that they reflect language use as it would be used outside of the classroom, but sometimes modified slightly to make sure that the students are understanding what we're saying. And I think that is perfectly authentic language use. When you think about children's books, they are modified to fit the audience, to fit children, right? So I think that we need to not always think that authentic is going to be better. This obsession with authenticity sometimes is a little bit problematic to me, especially when it becomes associated with native speakers, associated with being from other countries, associated with purity, right? That it has not been modified or contaminated. Sometimes I feel like we're putting authenticity above everything else. And sometimes the other problem is that then the implied opposite is that if you're not a native speaker, then I guess you are an inauthentic speaker. That's not the message that we want to convey to our students. And right now, I'm not a native speaker of English, and you're listening to me, so I hope that nobody fills out the form saying this was completely inauthentic. I think that we need to move away from classifying a resource as authentic based on the audience or based on the source. And in reality, again, modifying how we convey a message to reach the audience is 100% authentic language use. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with modifying the resource or modifying the text. So that adage of modify the task, not the test, that's not something I follow at all. Go ahead, please feel free to modify the text so that the students can have an authentically enjoyable experience with it. I do think that we need to think about the authenticity of experience, right? That we don't look at an infographic just to recognize 2 words, for example. And so I think that we need to think about the authenticity of purpose and the experience that the students are having with our resources, more than simply, hey, I found it and I didn't modify it, right? I think it's important to reflect on the purpose that we want to get out of the different texts, and then how we can accomplish that. Sometimes if you find it and it's perfectly okay unmodified, go for it. Why not? I'm not against authentic resources. But many times if you need to modify it, don't feel like you're doing something wrong, or that is something that is not pedagogically best practice or anything like that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with modifying a text so that it is good input for your students, that it is comprehensible input for your students. Okay, I'm going to stop right here, which was the last point that I wanted to make. And then I want to make sure that we give people a couple of times to fill out the evaluation form. If you are an Illinois educator, so if you are an Illinois K-12 teacher seeking professional development hours. Oh, here we go. Jude beat me to it. Thank you. Yes, please fill out the evaluation form so that you can get professional development hours. So the next session that we have a week from today is going to be mostly on output. So I hope that you can join us for that, and then you can get professional development hours on that webinar as well. All right, thank you everybody for being here, and I hope to see you next week.